Hello everyone, Ace here, and I do hope you are all enjoying a happy New Year's Eve. However, I do have some news that might be interesting for you all. As it turns out that the journalist community seems to actually be starting to back away from the social justice warriors. As an article from one Alyssa Rosenberg from the Washington Post has found its way onto several other news websites as well. And the article in question is simply titled, "A Cliffhanger Into a Decade That Married Politics and Culture." And while this article did originate from the Washington Post like I mentioned, we'll actually be looking at the version available on Charleston Gazette Mail, since you don't need a subscription to read it there. Now, as you may have guessed from the title, the whole purpose of this article is to look at the impacts that forcing politics into culture has had on the world. And the end result isn't exactly to the liking of Miss Rosenberg here, as the two first examples she provides of it backfiring are the 2016 election and Gamergate specifically, thereby implying that trying to force politics into culture ultimately led to these two eventualities. Now, that isn't to say that Alyssa Rosenberg here isn't woke herself, as she does try to provide the progressive narrative to these turn of events, as of course both of these occurrences are viewed as bad things, but that doesn't change the fact that she clearly views the progressive narrative that everything is political is actually a mistake, and this is most easily demonstrable by her closing paragraph, where she says, and I quote, "Maybe the next decade in politics and culture will bring a return to relative normancy, in which we all agree that politicians should be boring and effective and that culture should be escapist and disengaged. Maybe the movements of this decade will continue rather than fizzle out, producing an entertainment industry that's more diverse in human and intellectual terms, and public figures who establish new ways of communicating with the public. And so maybe it is fitting that this franchise-dominated decade is ending with a cliffhanger." There are actually two takeaways from this final paragraph, but they both come from the very first sentence of it. The first thing to take away is that the author actually openly admits here that culture should be escapist and disengaged in her opinion. And this is very interesting because the social justice narrative demands that everything must be viewed as political. To suggest in any way that it should be escapist or disengaged is to therefore defy social justice as an ideology. In fact, I would even argue that the idea of viewing everything through a political lens is actually a key cornerstone of woke culture. In other words, it's so important that the progressives simply cannot afford to surrender it, as doing so would mean losing a great deal of their social power, as the idea of viewing everything as political has actually allowed them to make some of their most severe accusations against people, accusations that otherwise make absolutely zero sense. But going back to the article itself, the second thing to note here is the author's desire for a return to normalcy, to go back to how things once were, which itself runs completely counter to the progressive agenda, which is actually rather interesting when you consider the fact that Ms. Rosenberg has indeed framed a return to normalcy as the most positive outcome here, because it presents the implication that the SJWs are losing the culture wars, and that the very most that the journalist community can hope for is a return to normalcy. So even though Ms. Rosenberg here actually presents the progressive narrative throughout her entire article, the fact still remains that the very conclusion that she provides is a pretty grim one for the SJW. And considering the fact that this article is being shared by several other publications, I would argue that this appears to be an attempt by the journalist community to distance themselves from the progressives. But unfortunately for the journalist, I believe that this effort is a little bit too little too late. And I wouldn't exactly be surprised if it turned out that the folks from Reset Era or Gamergate decided to use their same heavy-handed tactics against these particular journalists for daring to suggest that trying to force politics into everything is actually a mistake. But nevertheless, this actually seems like a rather interesting turn of events. And I will have to admit, 2019 has actually provided a few other examples of other individuals within other industries turning a blind eye to the SJW and benefiting as a result. The most notable example, of course, being the success of Joker by Warner Brothers. So while I don't exactly think we're completely out of the woods yet when it comes to the progressive narrative, I do believe that the tide has definitely turned. And I wouldn't exactly be surprised if it turned out that the mainstream media is starting to distance themselves from the woke brigade. Now, I do believe that this is something we should keep an eye on, but unfortunately only time will tell in this matter. So I will keep you guys informed should any news come to pass. But in any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.